Presently Angela reappeared. Zellaby became aware of her from the far off. It took him a moment or two to re-establish himself in the here and now and observe her expression.
"What's the matter, my dear?" he inquired, and added in recollection, "I thought you were bound for Train Hospital with a cornucopia."
"I started," she said. "Now I've come back. It seems that we're not allowed to leave the village."
Zellaby sat up. "That's absurd. The old fool can't put the whole place under arrest. As a J.P.,
he began indignantly. "It's not Sir John, it's the children. They're picketing all the roads, and they won't let us out."
"Are they, indeed?" exclaimed Zellaby. "That's extremely interesting."
"I wonder if—" "Interesting be damned," said his wife. "It's very unpleasant and quite outrageous. It's also rather alarming," she added, "because one can't see just what's behind it." Zellaby inquired how it was being done. She explained, concluding, "And it's only us, you see, people who live in the village, I mean. They're letting other people come and go as they like."
"But no violence?" asked Zellaby with a touch of anxiety.
"No. You simply have to stop. Several people have appealed to the police, and they've looked into it. Hopeless, of course. The children didn't stop them or bother them, so naturally they can't understand what the fuss is about. The only result is that those who had merely heard that Midwich is half-witted are now sure of it."
"They must have some reason for it, the children, I mean," said Zellaby.
Angela eyed him resentfully. "I dare say, and possibly it will be of great sociological interest, but that isn't the point at the moment. What I want to know is what is to be done about it."
"My dear," said Zellaby, soothingly, "one appreciates your feelings, but we've known for some time now that if it should suit the children to interfere with us, we have no way of stopping them. Well now, for some reason that I confess I do not perceive, it evidently does suit them."
"But, Gordon, there are these people seriously hurt, in Train Hospital. Their relatives want to visit them."
"My dear, I don't see that there is anything you can do but find one of them and put it to him on humane grounds. They might consider that, but it really depends on what their reason for doing it is, don't you think?"
Angela regarded her husband with a frown of dissatisfaction. She started to reply, thought better of it, and took herself off with an air of reproof. Zellaby shook his head as the door closed.
"Man's arrogance is boastful," he observed. "Woman's is something in the fibre. We do occasionally contemplate the once lordly dinosaurs and wonder when and how our little day will reach its end. But not she. Her eternity is an article of her faith. Great wars and disasters can ebb and flow. Races can rise and fall. Empires wither with suffering and death. But these are superficialities. She, woman, is perpetual, essential. She will go on forever. She doesn't believe in the dinosaurs. She doesn't really believe the world ever existed until she was upon it. Men may build and destroy and play with all their toys. They are uncomfortable nuisances, ephemeral conveniences, mere scamperers about, while women, in mystical umbilical connection with the great tree of life itself, knows that she is indispensable. One wonders whether the female dinosaur in her day was blessed with the same comfortable certainty."
He paused, in such obvious need of prompting that I said, "And the relevance to the present
is that while man finds the thought of his supersession abominable, she simply finds it unthinkable. And since she cannot think it, she must regard the hypothesis as frivolous."
It seemed to be my service again. "If you are implying that we see something which Mrs. Zellaby fails to see, I'm afraid
But, my dear fellow, if one is not blinded by a sense of indispensability, one must take it that we, like the other lords of creation before us, will one day be replaced. There are two ways in which it can happen, either through ourselves, by our self-destruction, or by the incursion of some species which we lack the equipment to subdue. Well, here we are now, face to face with a superior will and mind, and what are we able to bring against it?"
"That," I told him, "sounds defeatist. If, as I assume, you do mean it quite seriously, isn't it rather a large conclusion from rather a small instance?"
"Very much what my wife said to me when the instance was considerably smaller and younger," Zellaby admitted. She also went on to scout the proposition that such a remarkable thing could happen here, in a prosaic English village. In vain did I try to convince her that it would be no less remarkable wherever it should happen. She felt that it was decidedly a thing that would be less remarkable in more exotic places. A Balinese village, perhaps, or a Mexican pueblo. That it was essentially one of those sorts of things that happens to other people. Unfortunately, however, the instance has developed here, and with melancholy logic.
It isn't the locality that troubles me, I said. It's your assumptions. More particularly, you're taking it for granted that the children can do what they like, and there's no way of stopping them.
It would be foolish to be quite so didactic as that. It may be possible, but it will not be easy. Physically, we are poor, weak creatures compared with many animals, but we overcome them because we have better brains. The only thing that can beat us is something with a still better brain. That has scarcely seemed a threat. For one thing, its occurrence appeared to be improbable, and for another, it seemed even more improbable that we should allow it to survive to become a menace. Yet here it is, another little gimmick out of Pandora's infinite evolutionary box. The contesserate mind. 2 mosaics, one of 30, the other of 28 tiles. What can we, with our separate brains only in clumsily fumbling touch with one another, expect to do against 30 brains, working almost as one?
I protested that, even so, the children could scarcely have accumulated enough knowledge in a mere 9 years to oppose successfully the whole mass of human knowledge, but Zellaby shook his head.
The government has, for reasons of its own, provided them with some excellent teachers, so that the sum of their knowledge should be considerable. Indeed, I know it is, for I lecture to them myself sometimes, you know. That has importance, but it is not the source of the threat. One is not unaware that Francis Bacon wrote Nam et ipsa scientia potestas est. Knowledge itself is power. And one must regret that so eminent a scholar should, at times, talk through his hat. The encyclopedia is crammed full of knowledge and can do nothing with it. We all know people who have amazing memories for facts, with no ability to use them. A computing engine can roll out knowledge by the ream in multiplicate. But none of this knowledge is of the least use until it is informed by understanding. Knowledge is simply a kind of fuel. It needs the motor of understanding to convert it into power. Now, what frightens me is the thought of the power producible by an understanding working on an even small quantity of knowledge fuel, when it has an extraction efficiency 30 times that of our own. What it may produce when the children are mature, I cannot begin to imagine.
I frowned. As always, I was a little unsure of Zellaby. You are quite seriously maintaining that we have no means of preventing this group of 58 children from taking what course they choose? I insisted.
I am, he nodded. What do you suggest we could do? You know what happened to that crowd last night. They intended to attack the children. Instead, they were induced to fight one another. Send police, and they would do the same. Send soldiers against them, and they would be induced to shoot one another.
Possibly, I conceded. But there must be other ways of tackling them. From what you've told me, nobody knows nearly enough about them. They appear to have detached themselves emotionally from their host mothers quite early, if indeed they ever had the emotions we normally expect. Most of them choose to adopt progressive segregation as soon as it was offered. As a result, the village knows extremely little of them. In quite a short time, most people seem scarcely to have thought of them as individuals. They found them difficult to tell apart. They got into the habit of regarding them collectively so that they have tended to become two-dimensional figures, with only a limited kind of reality. Zellaby looked appreciative of the point. You're perfectly right, my dear fellow. There is a lack of normal contacts and sympathies, but that is not entirely our shortcoming. I have myself kept as close to them as I can, but I am still at a distance. In spite of all my efforts, I still find them, as you excellently put it, two-dimensional. And it is strongly my impression that the people at the Grange have done no better. Then the question remains, I said, how do we get more data? We contemplated that for a while,
until Zellaby emerged from his reverie to say, "Has it occurred to you to wonder what your own status here is, my dear fellow? If you were thinking of leaving today, it might be as well to find out whether the children regard you as one of us or not."
That was an aspect that had not occurred to me, and I found it a little startling. I decided to find out. Bernard had, it appeared, gone off in the Chief Constable's car, so I borrowed his for the test. I found the answer a little way along the Opley Road. A very odd sensation. My hand and foot were guided to bring the car to a halt by no volition of my own. One of the girl children was sitting by the roadside, nibbling at a stalk of grass, and looking at me without expression. I tried to put the gear in again. My hand wouldn't do it. Nor could I bring my foot to the clutch pedal. I looked at the girl and told her that I did not live in Midwich, and wanted to get home. She simply shook her head. I tried the gear lever again, and found that the only way I could move it was into reverse.
Zellaby said on my return. "So, you are an honorary villager, are you? I rather thought you might be. Just remind me to tell Angela to let the cook know. There's a good fellow."
At the same time that Zellaby and I were talking at Kyle Manor, more talk, similar in matter but different in manner, was going on at the Grange. Dr. Torrance, feeling some sanction in the presence of Colonel Westcott, had endeavoured to answer the Chief Constable's questions more explicitly than before. A stage had been reached, however, when lack of coordination between the parties could no longer be disguised, and a noticeably offbeat query caused the doctor to say a little forlornly, "I'm afraid I cannot have made the situation quite clear to you, Sir John." The Chief Constable grunted impatiently.
"Everybody keeps on telling me that, and I'm not denying it. Nobody around here seems to be capable of making anything clear. Everybody keeps on telling me, too, and without producing a scrap of evidence that I can understand, that these infernal children are in some way responsible for last night's affair. Well, even you, who I am given to understand, are in charge of them. I agree that I do not understand a situation in which young children are allowed to get so thoroughly out of hand that they can cause a breach of the peace amounting to a riot. I don't see why I should be expected to understand it. It is as a constable that I wish to see one of the ringleaders and find out what he has to say about it."
"But, Sir John, I've already explained to you that there are no ringleaders."
I know, I heard you. Everyone is equal here, and all that. All very well perhaps in theory, but you know as well as I do that in every group there are fellows that stand out, and that those are the chaps you've got to get hold of. Manage them, and you can manage the rest."
He paused, expectantly. Dr. Torrance exchanged a helpless look with Colonel Westcott. Bernard gave a slight shrug, and the faintest of nods. Dr. Torrance's look of unhappiness increased. He said uneasily, "Very well, Sir John, since you make it virtually a police order that I have no alternative, but I must ask you to watch your words carefully. The children are very, sensitive." His choice of the final word was unfortunate. In his own vocabulary, it had a somewhat technical meaning. In the Chief Constable's, it was a word used by doting mothers about spoilt sons, and did nothing to make him feel more sympathetically disposed towards the children. He made a vowelless sound of disapproval as Dr. Torrance got up and left the room. Bernard half opened his mouth to reinforce the doctor's warnings, and then decided that it would only increase the Chief Constable's irritation, thus doing more harm than good. The cussedness of common sense, Bernard reflected, was that, invaluable as it might be in the right soils, it could turn into a pestiferous kind of bindweed in others. So the two waited in silence until the doctor presently returned, bringing one of the boy children with him. "This is Eric," he said, by way of introduction. To the boy he added, "Sir John Tenby wishes to ask you some questions. It is his duty as Chief Constable, you see, to make a report on the trouble last night." The boy nodded, and turned to look at Sir John. Dr. Torrance resumed his seat at his desk, and watched the two of them intently and uneasily. The boy's regard was steady, careful, but quite neutral. It gave no trace of feeling. Sir John met it with equal steadiness. "A healthy-looking boy," he thought.
A bit thin. Well, not exactly thin in the sense of being scraggy. Slight would be a better word. It was difficult to make much of a judgment from the features. The face was good-looking, though without weakness, which often accompanies male good looks. On the other hand, it did not show strength. The mouth, indeed, was a little small, though not petulant. There was not a lot to be learned from the face as a whole. The eyes, however, were even more remarkable than he had been led to expect. He had been told of the curious golden colour of the irises, but no one had succeeded in conveying to him their striking lambency, their strange effect of being softly lit from within. For a moment it disquieted him. Then he took himself in hand, reminded himself that he had some kind of freak to deal with. A boy only 9 years old, yet looking every bit of 16, brought up, moreover, on some of these fiddle-faddling theories of self-expression, non-inhibition, and so on. He decided to treat the boy as if he were the age he looked, and constrained himself into that man-to-boy attitude that is represented by its practitioners as man-to-man. "Serious business last night," he observed. "Our job to clear it up, and find out what really happened. Who was responsible for the trouble, and so forth. People keep on telling me that you and the others here were. Now, what do you say to that?" "No," said the boy promptly. The chief constable nodded. One could scarcely expect an immediate admission, in any case. "What happened, exactly?" he asked. "The village people came here to burn the grange down," said the boy. "You're sure of that?" "It was what they said, and there was no other reason to bring them here at that time," said the boy. "All right. We'll not go into the whys and wherefores just now. Let's take it from there. You say some of them came intending to burn the place. Then I suppose others came to stop them doing it, and the fighting started." "Yes," agreed the boy, but less definitely. "Then, in point of fact, you and your friends had nothing to do with it. You were just spectators." "No," said the boy. "We had to defend ourselves. It was necessary, or they would have burnt the house." "You mean you called out to some of them to stop the rest? Something like that?" "No," the boy told him patiently. "We made them fight one another. We could simply have sent them away, but if we had, they would very likely have come back some other time. Now they will not. They understand it is better for them to leave us alone." The chief constable paused, a little nonplussed. "You say you made them fight one another. How did you do that?" "It is too difficult to explain. I don't think you could understand," said the boy judicially. Sir John pinked a little. "Nevertheless, I'd like to hear," he said, with an air of generous restraint that was wasted. "It won't be of any use," the boy told him. He spoke simply and without innuendo, as one stating a fact. The chief constable's face became a deeper pink. Dr. Torrance put in hurriedly, "This is an extremely abstruse matter, Sir John, and one which all of us here have been trying to understand, with very little headway for some years now. One can really get little nearer to it than to say that children willed the people in the crowd to attack one another." Sir John looked at him, and then at the boy. He muttered, but held himself in check. Presently, after 2 or 3 deep breaths, he spoke to the boy again, but now with his tone a little ruffled. "However it was done, and we'll have to go into that later, you are admitting that you were responsible for what happened?" "We are responsible for defending ourselves," the boy said. "To the extent of 4 lives and 13 serious injuries, when you could, you say, have simply sent them away?" "They wanted to kill us," the boy told him, indifferently. The chief constable looked lengthily at him. "I don't understand how you can have done it, but I take your word for it that you did for the present, also your word that it was unnecessary." "They would have come again. It would have been necessary then," replied the boy. "You can't be sure of that. Your whole attitude is monstrous. Don't you feel the least compunction for these unfortunate people?" "No," the boy told him. "Why should we? Yesterday afternoon one of them shot one of us.
Now we must protect ourselves. But not by private vengeance. The law is for your protection, and for everyone's. The law did not protect Wilfred from being shot. It would not have protected us last night. The law punishes the criminal after he has been successful. It is no use to us. We intend to stay alive. But you don't mind being responsible, so you tell me, for the deaths of other people. Do we have to go round in circles? Asked the boy. I have answered your questions because we thought it better that you should understand the situation. As you apparently have not grasped it, I will put it more plainly. It is that if there is any attempt to interfere with us or molest us by anybody, we shall defend ourselves. We have shown that we can, and we hope that that will be warning enough to prevent further trouble. Sir John stared at the boy speechlessly while his knuckles whitened and his face empurpled. He half rose from his chair as if he meant to attack the boy, and then sank back, thinking better of it. Some seconds passed before he could trust himself to speak. Presently, in a half-choked voice, he addressed the boy, who was watching him with a kind of critically detached interest. "You damned young blackguard! You insufferable little prig! How dare you speak to me like that? Do you understand that I represent the police force of this country? If you don't, it's time you learnt it, and I'll see that you do, by God! Talking to your elders like that, you swollen-headed little upstart. So you're not to be molested. You'll defend yourselves, will you? Where do you think you are? You've got a lot to learn, me lad, aho!" He broke off suddenly, and sat staring at the boy. Dr. Torrance leant forward over his desk. "Eric," he began in protest, but made no move to interfere. Bernard Westcott remained carefully still in his chair, watching. The Chief Constable's mouth went slack. His jaw fell a little. His eyes widened and seemed to go on widening. His hair rose slightly. Sweat burst out on his forehead, at his temples, and came trickling down his face. Inarticulate gobblings came from his mouth. Tears ran down the sides of his nose. He began to tremble, but seemed unable to move. Then, after long, rigid seconds, he did move. He lifted hands that fluttered, and fumbled them to his face. Behind them, he gave queer, thin screams. He slid out of the chair onto his knees on the floor, and fell forward. He lay there, grovelling and trembling, making high, whinnying sounds as he clawed at the carpet, trying to dig himself into it. Suddenly he vomited. The boy looked up. To Dr. Torrance he said, as if answering a question, "He is not hurt. He wanted to frighten us, so we have shown him what it means to be frightened. He'll understand better now. He'll be all right when his glands are in balance again." Then he turned away and went out of the room, leaving the two men looking at one another. Bernard pulled out a handkerchief and dabbed at the sweat that stood in drops on his own forehead. Dr. Torrance sat motionless, his face a sickly grey. They turned to look at the Chief Constable. Sir John was lying slackly now, seemingly unconscious, drawing long, greedy breaths, shaken occasionally by a violent tremor. "My God!" exclaimed Bernard. He looked at Torrance again. "And you have been here 3 years?" "There's never been anything remotely like this," the doctor said. "We've suspected many possibilities, but there's never been any enmity. And after this, thank God for that." "Yes, you could well do worse than that," Bernard told him. He looked at Sir John again. "This chap ought to be got away before he pulls round. We'd better be out of the way too. It's the sort of situation where a man can't forgive witnesses. Send in a couple of his men to collect him. Tell him he's had an attack of some kind." 5 minutes later they stood on the steps and watched the Chief Constable driven off, still only semi-conscious. "All right when his glands are in balance," murmured Bernard. "They seem better at physiology than at psychology. They've broken that man for the rest of his life."
Thank you for watching the video. Subscribe to hear more great stories.